Geology students. We got an exciting lecture for you today. It's chapter 15, Life of the Mesozoic Era. And here you can see a picture from the first page of your textbook for chapter 15. And there's dinosaurs there. Please don't forget the Mesozoic Era, which goes from 245 million years ago to 65 million years ago, was dominated by dinosaurs. Not a single dinosaur survived until the Cenozoic era. Why? Well, there was a mass extinction 65 million years ago that wiped out the dinosaurs and other creatures too, such as ammonites. And I'm going to talk about it today, but what you also need to do is watch the video link that I sent you. It's a YouTube video on why the dinosaurs became extinct. So, the Mesozoic Era, one last time, it's called the Age of the Dinosaurs. They first appeared during the first period of the Mesozoic. And by now you should know that's the Triassic period. So dinosaurs appeared during the Triassic period, and they continued to thrive and evolve into many different forms during the next period called the Jurassic period. And they would become extinct at the end of the Cretaceous period, or the end of the Mesozoic era, 65 million years ago. Mammals evolved during the Mesozoic era, but there were only 3 to 4 different species of mammals that existed during the Mesozoic era. They lived in a fear of dinosaurs. These small mammals, and we're talking anything about from rat sized to maybe groundhog sized, lived underground. They dug holes underground. And since there were so many dinosaurs and other threats out there, they didn't come out to hunt until nighttime. So they were nocturnal mammals. Nocturnal meaning that they slept during the day and fed during the night. They ate little lizards and turtles and insects and whatever they could get, worms. We're also going to talk about plants. We talked about there being 4 different kinds of plants: seedless non-vascular, seedless vascular, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. Your first angiosperms evolved during the Mesozoic era. And our first flowers appeared during the Mesozoic era. Remember, all plants that have angiosperms are any plants that have fruits, nuts, or flowers, or are grasses. And the first flower to appear is the magnolia. So that's the oldest known flower. Also, other things happened. Remember, 245 million years ago, when the Paleozoic era ended and the Mesozoic era began, we had that great mass extinction called the Permian extinction, the greatest mass extinction to ever face the biological world on our planet Earth. Trilobites became extinct. Blastoids became extinct. Many of your fish became extinct at the end of the Permian, like acanthodians and placoderms. 95% of your brachiopods became extinct. It was a catastrophe that has never befallen the world again. Since the brachiopods were decimated, 95% of the brachiopods became extinct at the end of the Permian 245 million years ago. Bivalves, phylum Mollusca, class Bivalvia. Some people have been getting it wrong in lab. A bivalve is not a brachiopod. It's a mollusk. It's a phylum Mollusca. They took by and large, they took the place of brachiopods in in that niche of the biological world. Cephalopods rebounded strongly after the end of the Permian. So did gastropods, your snails. The other thing you want to remember for the test is the first vertebrates to appear were the fish, and they evolved from the lobe-finned fish to the amphibians, probably sometime during the Silurian that occurred. And then the amphibians evolved into the reptiles, and so the first reptiles didn't appear until maybe the Mississippian, and they include the plesiosaurs. And then the reptiles evolved into the mammals through the Theraspids, and they also evolved into dinosaurs. Birds were the last vertebrates to appear in geologic history, and they evolved from theropod dinosaurs. You might ask yourself, what in God's name does he mean by theropod dinosaurs? Well, keep watching the video and you'll find out. "245 million years ago, Pangea came together. That's what led to the Great Permian extinction. That led to conditions becoming very dry for most of the continents during the Triassic period, and continuing on to part of the Jurassic period. This led to the mass extinction of most of the large amphibians, because amphibians need water to keep their skin moist and to lay their eggs. Dinosaurs would thrive in this new, drier climate. And one of the reasons why that is because dinosaurs don't need to drink as much water. They don't excrete as much water in their feces. And their water needs were less than other reptiles. Some marine invertebrates thrived during the Mesozoic era, and one of them are these extinct nectonic cephalopods, phylum Mollusca, and these are called belemnites. Belemnites, or belemnoids, are obviously squid-like creatures. They swim. They were predators. They were very common during the Mesozoic era. Most of you got it right in your labs when you identified the belemnites as cephalopods, but some of you got it wrong. And do you remember a fossil that looked like this, with all these little bullet-like things? These stone parts were inside of these belemnites. So if you see this, you know it's phylum Mollusca, class Cephalopoda, and they're nectonic, and they're from these Mesozoic belemnites. They were ubiquitous, they were everywhere in the Mesozoic seas. Various planktonic organisms, like these Foraminifera, these are blown up so that these are smaller than a pinprick in reality. The only way you can really show these to students is by using an electron microscope. But they kind of have these little chambers in them. I think you can see this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little chambers in it. And they're planktonic organisms. These are the most common forms of life on planet Earth. And they thrived during the Mesozoic. And you could, in a gallon of seawater, or Mesozoic seawater, you might find hundreds of thousands of these little creatures. So small you cannot see them with the naked eye. The animal lived inside of this test We don't. When we talk about microscopic organisms, we don't use the word shells. Microscopic shells are called tests, and they lived inside of these tests. When they died, their tests would fall to the bottom of the sea floor, and since their tests are made of calcite, the tests would end up becoming marine limestones eventually through time. Other planktonic organisms that thrived during the Mesozoic are these things here called Coccolithophores with various beautiful shapes. Here you can see their tests blown up through an electron microscope so that you can see them. We have an electron microscope in the lab in Oak Ridge. So if any of you are taking physical geology this summer, we might use it for your honors project if you're interested in doing something like that. We mentioned the fact that there are these 6 lines of fish in the previous chapter. Ostracoderms, placoderms, and acanthodians all became extinct during the Paleozoic era. Ostracoderms went first at the end of the Devonian when there was global cooling that wiped out most of those coral reefs. Acanthodians and placoderms managed to survive to the end of the Paleozoic. They died out 245 million years ago. Who are the survivors that made it into the Mesozoic? Well, you got the cartilaginous fish, such as sharks, which belong to class Chondrichthyes. Phylum Chordata. But it was mostly bony fish with bones inside of their body, that dominate our planet. Most of the world's fish are ray-fin fish, but we have a few lobe-fin fish survivors, and we showed earlier on how the lobe-fin fish, some of them evolved into our earliest amphibians during the Silurian and Devonian periods of the Paleozoic era, the previous era, the Paleozoic era. First thing we're going to talk about are marine reptiles and pterosaurs. If you watch that video link that I sent you on why the dinosaurs became extinct 65 million years ago, you might have noticed a creature in the film called a pterosaur. What is a pterosaur? First thing I'll tell you, and I think that's the only flaw that I could see in that film, is they didn't mention the fact, and they should have, that pterosaurs are not dinosaurs. In Jurassic Park and other films, they show these pterosaurs, and they don't mention they're not flying dinosaurs. Dinosaurs did not fly. Pterosaurs are flying reptiles. They're close cousins of the dinosaurs, but they're not dinosaurs because they don't have the diapsid skull, 2 holes behind the eye socket. Let's talk about these pterosaurs first. Pterosaurs did not exist during the preceding Paleozoic era. They died out 65 million years ago with the dinosaurs. We have never found a pterosaur fossil in Cenozoic rocks. And they're not birds. They're flying reptiles. They're cold-blooded, whereas birds are warm-blooded. Another difference between pterosaurs and birds is that pterosaurs did not have feathers. And birds have, let's take a look at a bird. Here you can see birds. And you can see that they've got their two hind legs here. And then they have feathers on their wings like this. Now let's take a look at pterosaurs. Pterosaurs, like this one you see here, have their arms in the wings, and then have these two rear limbs here, but their arms actually extend, and one of their fingers is very long, and then there's a skin flap that's attached between their rear limbs and that first finger, which is elongated. So it's a different structure. You can actually see the arms in the wings. Nowadays, the skies are dominated by birds. But during the Mesozoic Era, the skies were dominated by pterosaurs. Let's take a look at these a little more careful. You can see they come in all different sizes, these pterosaurs. Some of them quite small, some of them quite large. Back during the Mesozoic Era, there was a type of pterosaur, and it looked like this, that sometimes could be 20 or 30 feet long, depending on how old it grew. And they would fly between North America and South America every year. Imagine the skies filled with these large pterosaurs. Their mating grounds were during the winter were down in South America, when it was warm during our winter. And the males often had these very colorful things around their eyes and on their beak to attract females. The males would land and try to find a nesting spot. And the males would fight over nesting spots. If you had a better nesting spot, you had a higher chance of attracting a female. The females would fly ahead and the males would try and get their attention. Pterosaurs reproduced by internal fertilization, sexual intercourse basically, and then the females, once the mating had completed, would fly off to find a place to lay their eggs once they were ready. Some of the pterosaurs had these very strange crests on their heads, like this. We think that these things are mostly sexual attractants, things for especially for male pterosaurs to attract female pterosaurs. So now that we've established what pterosaurs are, let's talk for a moment about marine reptiles. Marine reptiles. There's a whole bunch of different ones. First thing I'll tell you is that marine reptiles obviously live in the ocean. That's why I call them marine. They're not dinosaurs. They're reptiles. Reptiles are cold-blooded organisms, whereas dinosaurs, as we're gonna talk about later, were probably warm-blooded. So, the three kinds of marine reptiles you need to know about for this class are ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, mosasaurs. Probably a picture of one of these will be on the test, and you'll have to be able to identify it. We might have some questions on these different types of marine reptiles. The marine reptiles, the ichthyosaurs, the plesiosaurs, and the mosasaurs, only existed during the Mesozoic Era. So that whatever caused the demise of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago and the pterosaurs also eliminated these magnificent, large marine reptiles. Let's talk about the first one, ichthyosaurs. I'll tell you one easy way to remember this is ichthyo in Latin means fish-like. So these are fish-like reptiles, because saurs means reptiles. This is what they look like. Here you can see them eating a cephalopod. This type is called an ammonite. They're obviously nectonic. They swam. What do they look like to you? Kind of look like dolphins or porpoises, don't they? Remember, we talked about dolphins and porpoises having a similar shape as ichthyosaurs. They both evolved to have a similar shape, but they're not closely related. That's convergent evolution. So, since their body was similar to that of a dolphin or a porpoise or even a fish, we think they lived similar lifestyles. They hunted in the oceans. We could tell, if you look carefully, you can see the sets of razor-sharp teeth in here. Those would be used to tear apart the shells of cephalopods or fish or squid or shrimp or anything that they could eat. They've got a streamlined body, we think that they could move very quickly through the oceans. They have a body made for speed. They have two paddle-like arms in the front and two paddle-like arms in the back. And if they just used two of the arms on the left, they could go right. The two on the right, they could turn left. If they used all four arms, they could have great bursts of speed when they wanted to capture their prey. We've got a dorsal fin and a tail fin here. These are reptiles. How do we know they were reptiles? Because when you look at their skeletons, they have the same skull shape, the same anatomy as a reptile. Another thing we know about ichthyosaurs is, since they're reptiles, they don't have gills, they have lungs. So they had to come up for air a lot. They couldn't live in the deep ocean because by the time they went up for air, they would have suffocated. So we think they lived in the shallow ocean. They had large brains, as all predators do, all carnivores do. Also notice their large eyes. The fact that they had large eyes like this, we think, is to focus light so that they could see in the darkness. They needed to have good eyesight to catch their prey. They couldn't come onto land with this kind of body and lay eggs. So they had to give birth to live young. Let's take a look at an ichthyosaur giving birth. Here you can actually see an ichthyosaur fossil where it's giving birth. You can see the baby coming out. Notice that it comes out with its tail first. If it came out with its head first, it would suffocate. But as long as the head was in the mother's womb, it could breathe. So that's why they used the ichthyosaurs would come out tail first. And the little babies, once they came out of their mother, the first thing they had to do was to go up for air. Let's say they were 100-foot water or 200-foot water. Their first job would be to go up and get air. They could hold their breath for maybe more than an hour. Go down to the bottom of the sea floor and hide amongst the crags of the corals, because there were lots of things that would want to eat these little ichthyosaurs. They were in constant danger until they became large enough to protect themselves. Also, remember, ichthyosaurs are reptiles, so the mother would not have any mothering instinct. It wouldn't try to protect the babies. You're on your own once you're born. The ichthyosaurs were the marine reptiles most adapted to life in the sea. Let's take a look at the next type of marine reptile. These are called plesiosaurs. You might have seen these before. Here you can see some of them were very large. Some of them were only 4 feet or 3 feet long. Some of them might have been 50 feet long. Notice the 4 paddle-like arms. You don't see this in marine organisms today, but this was a common form of locomotion during the Mesozoic era for these marine reptiles. They would go onto land to lay their eggs. One thing that makes it easy to remember to differentiate between these and ichthyosaurs is that plesiosaurs had long necks. Then they're a relatively small head, and then sharp teeth made for killing. Plesiosaurs ate fish. They could sometimes attack ichthyosaurs. They could eat shrimp or anything that a predator would eat during the ocean. Cephalopods were another common prey for the plesiosaur. Some people say that there's one of these living in Loch Ness in Scotland. And I could tell you I was in Scotland and it was colder than the witches, and I didn't see any plesiosaurs. There's no plesiosaur. There cannot be a plesiosaur in Loch Ness. Why? Because they would have to come up for air. There's no way in God's name. And they've searched and searched and searched Loch Ness, and they can't find. You know, you have these grainy black and white photos, and they have this head that looks like a plesiosaur. I guarantee you, if there were really plesiosaurs in Loch Ness, they would be obvious. Third type of marine reptile we want to look at is called a mosasaur. Mosasaurs were the largest predators that ever existed in the ocean. Here you can see that one eating a shark. Interesting place to go to if you have time is the Frank H. McClung Museum in Knoxville. It's at UT. They have a skeleton of a juvenile mosasaur about 15 feet long. And they lived in Tennessee, believe it or not. Tells us that Tennessee must have been under a shallow ocean during the Mesozoic era, because we find their skeletons around Nashville. So the area around Nashville must have been shallow ocean where these things would have lived. Let's take a look at their skull. You can see these from their skull that these creatures were killing machines. These are not teeth. These are teeth for tearing apart flesh. Large brain case, again indicating a carnivore. So their teeth are very sharp and therefore tearing apart flesh. Some of these would grow quite long, 50 feet long. And these were the terrors of the Mesozoic oceans. They're easy to tell. You can tell that they look different than the plesiosaurs. They have this strong muscular neck. And they don't look anything like a plesiosaur. We mentioned the fact that amphibians had evolved during the preceding Paleozoic era. When Pangea came together, conditions became dry, and very few of these amphibians survived into the Mesozoic. You did have a few that made it. Frogs and salamanders, they're still with us today. And toads, they survived. But amphibians were largely decimated by the Permian extinction, and so there were no big amphibian, or there are very few big amphibians left to survive into the Mesozoic era. This shows you what a Triassic forest might have looked like. You could see your seedless non-vascular plants, your ferns. We had but back during the Mesozoic, there was no grass. Grass did not exist yet. Grass would not evolve until about 15 million years ago during the Cenozoic era. So the plains were covered by ferns, and this was one of the primary food sources for your herbivore dinosaurs, your dinosaurs that ate plants. They love to eat ferns. And notice also you got all these trees, and these are mostly gymnosperms. So gymnosperms are the dominant plant form, along with your seedless non-vascular plants such as your ferns and horsetails during the Mesozoic era. It's not to say that the angiosperms weren't there. They did show up during the Mesozoic, such as the magnolias. But it wouldn't be until the Cenozoic era until the angiosperms would dominate the plant world of planet Earth. One of the most common types of gymnosperms are these cycads. Here's a few that still survive today. But back in the Mesozoic, these would grow very tall, sometimes 30 feet, 40 feet. And then notice that the leaves are on the top of the trees. And some of the really tall dinosaurs that we'll be talking about, called the sauropods, would feed on these cycads. And in your previous fossil lab, we had a tree trunk that I had collected, and that's a cycad plant. This shows you the reproductive cycle of a angiosperm. And the angiosperms did appear during the Mesozoic, even though they were not dominant. And one of the new inventions of this new class of plants was flowers and also covered seeds. This would lead to a big advantage. And the way angiosperms reproduce is some flowers will release pollen, and pollen is sperm. But the thing is, with angiosperms, they used certain birds like hummingbirds and insects and they're attracted to the pollen, and they get it on their legs when they're feeding on this pollen. Some of it gets on their legs, and then they'll travel to another plant and bring it over to the other plant, and this will come into contact with the pistil, which contains the eggs of the plant, and sperm and egg makes a seed. And the seed is fertilized once the pollen reaches the pistil. And you can see that the plant is really an embryo. The seed is really an embryo. And even though we might not think of plants being sexual organisms, this is a form of sexual reproduction. It's just not internal fertilization. Then they do mitosis, and they produce a seedling. And the fact that these seeds have this covering on them, the angiosperms, also gives them a higher chance of survival, because that extra covering on the seed gives the seed a higher chance of germinating. If they're trampled on by animals or insects or dinosaurs or whatever, the embryo inside is covered, has a big armor around it. All this covering, and it has a higher chance of survival than your gymnosperm seeds, which don't have this covering. Here you can see definitive proof that from these fossils in China that angiosperms were there during the Mesozoic. You can see flowers. Flowers are an ingenious way that angiosperms have learned to attract insects and birds to spread their seed. Another way that angiosperms spread their seed is through nuts or fruits, which also use animals and birds and insects to spread their seed. Next picture here I'm going to show you is how your early Paleozoic reptiles, which were quadrupeds, meaning they walked on four legs, evolved in all of these different vertebrates. We first of all have our reptiles, snakes and lizards and tuataras. We have marine reptiles like ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs and mosasaurs. And then we had some of them evolve to make crocodiles or pterosaurs, and then others evolve into dinosaurs. And some theropod dinosaurs evolved into the birds, which still exist today. You have your turtles and your theraspids, your first mammal-like reptiles, and your true mammals appeared here in the Mesozoic, and they're called therapsids. We're going to take a look at those. And obviously, during the Cenozoic era, once the dinosaurs were gone, the mammals dominated the planet. The earliest dinosaurs appeared during the Triassic period, and they were bipeds, bipedal, meaning they walked on two legs. And this one here was a very common one. It's a small carnivorous dinosaur, and it's called a theropod. What is a theropod? A theropod is a carnivorous dinosaur. How do we know this is a carnivore? Because of its large brain and its teeth. They're arranged and they're shaped for killing. Some of them were quite small. Some of them might have only been 2 feet tall. Others might have been 6 foot tall or 8 foot tall. The big dinosaurs wouldn't come until later on. In the next video, we'll talk about the 7 different kinds of dinosaurs.